Welcome to Demystifying Math. In this lesson, we're going to be solving quadratic equations using radicals. We're given that x squared equals 9, and we want to be able to find x. So we're looking for a number that multiplies by itself that gives you 9. Of course, that number is 3. 3 times 3 is 9, or you could say that 3 squared is equal to 9. But there is a second solution, and that solution is negative 3. Because when you multiply negative 3 times negative 3, you also get positive 9. Remember that two negatives multiplied together give you a positive. Or you could say that negative 3 squared is equal to 9. So what we want to do is be able to solve these algebraically. So we're going to work the equation by taking the square root of both sides. So when we take the square root of x squared, we get x. And when we take the square root of 9, we get 3. But remembering that we have two solutions, one positive and one negative, we're going to put plus or minus in front of the number 3 in order to show that we have those two solutions. Alright, here's our next problem. We have 1/2 x squared minus 1 equals 49, and we want to solve for x. So the first thing that we're going to do is isolate x squared. So we're going to bring our 1 over to the other side. So here we had negative 1. We added it to both sides of the equation, so we have 50 over here. Now the next step in order to isolate x squared is to get rid of the 1/2. So we're going to multiply both sides by 2. So we have x squared here, and 50 times 2 gives us 100. Then our next step is to take the square root of both sides. So notice that I put the plus or minus here. As soon as I take the square root, I remember to put plus or minus right away. So we're taking the positive or negative square root of 100, which is 10. So we have plus or minus 10 as our two solutions. Now let's check our work. So going back to our original equation where we had x here, we're going to put in 10. So our first step in simplifying this is to square the 10. So we get 100. Then our next step would be to do the multiplication. So we take half of 100 and we get 50. Then we're going to subtract the 1 and we get 49, which is the solution that we wanted to get. Now let's plug in the negative 10. So here we have negative 10 all squared, which is going to give us a positive 100 as well. So now we're actually back to the same step that we had up there in the first check. So now we have 49 as well. So you can see that both solutions are working for this equation. Here's our next problem. We have 3x squared plus 20 equals 170. So our first step is to isolate x squared. So we're going to do that by undoing the addition first. So we're bringing the 20 over to the other side, or subtracting it from both sides of the equation. So we get 150 here. Now our next step is to undo the multiplication. So we're going to divide both sides by 3, or we could say we're multiplying by 1/3. But 150 times 1/3 is 50. So we've now isolated the x squared. Once we isolate the x squared, then we're going to take the square root of both sides. So we have the square root of x squared, which is x, and the square root of 50. Now again, remember that we're putting plus or minus there because we actually have two solutions. Then the square root of 50 is not a perfect square this time. So what I'm going to do is break it up as a perfect square times some number. So 25 is a perfect square, and it goes into 50 twice. So you have the square root of 25 times 2. We can take the square root of 25, which is 5. We can't take the square root of 2, so we're going to leave it under the radical. So we have plus or minus 5 square roots of 2 as our two solutions. Now we're going to check our work. So where we had an x in our original equation, we're going to put 5 square roots of 2. We're checking the positive answer at this point. Now when we take 5 square roots of 2 and we square it, we're just going to square the 5, which is 25. And we're going to square the square root of 2, which simply gives us 2. Now we want to see if this is equal to 170. So we're going to simplify it. So 25 times 2 is 50. Then doing the multiplication here, we have 150. And the last thing you do is the addition, so we get 170. So it does work out. Now let's try our negative solution. When we're putting in the negative 5 square roots of 2, you're going to square negative 5 first. Well, negative times a negative is going to give you positive, so we still have positive 25 here. We still have the 2 from squaring the square root. This square root and the squaring, they undo each other, so you always get back what's underneath the radical here. And then, of course, we have the 50 times 3, 150, and 20 make 170. So this checks out as well. For our next problem, we have 15x squared minus 350 equals 5x squared minus 170. So we need to isolate x squared. So what I did was bring my like terms together on one side of the equation. So I brought this 5x squared over to the other side by subtracting it from both sides of the equation. So 15x squared minus 5x squared gives us 10x squared. And then I'm going to bring my constants to the other side. So I'm going to add 350 to 170, and I get 180. For my next step, I'm going to divide both sides by 10. So I have x squared equals 18. And then you're going to take the square root of both sides. So I put plus or minus here, reminding myself that I have two solutions. And we have the square root of 18, which is not a perfect square. So I looked for a perfect square factor of 18, which is 9. 9 times 2 is 18. So we're taking the square root of 9, which is 3, and we have square root of 2 left over. So our two solutions are plus or minus 3 square roots of 2. Okay, let's check our work. Going back to the original equation, wherever we have an x, we're going to put in 3 square roots of 2. So I put it in the first x squared and put it in for the second x. Now we're squaring first, because remember your order of operations, you're going to do exponents, then multiplication, then the subtraction. So we have 3 squared, which is 9, and the square root of 2 squared, which is 2. And I did that on both sides of the equation. Now you're going to do your multiplication in the parentheses, so you have 18 and 18 here. Then you're going to do this multiplication, 15 times 18, which is 270, and 5 times 18, which is 90. And lastly, you do the subtraction, and on both sides we got negative 80, so it checked out. Now, you can imagine that if you had put a negative in here for negative 3 square roots of 2, it would have worked out just as well. So you can work that one out if you need to. For our last problem, we have x minus 3l squared minus 5 equals 40. And we want to be able to isolate x. Now this time, it's not just x squared, it's x minus 3 all squared. So you really have to isolate the x minus 3 all squared first. So I brought the 5 over to the other side, and I have 45. Now because this whole thing is squared, I have to take the square root next to undo that. So we end up with x minus 3 on the left side, and plus or minus square roots of 45 on the right. And then I broke 45 up as a perfect square, which is 9, times a number. So we're going to have 3 square roots of 5. Now we're going to bring our 3 over to the other side, so we're adding it to this. So it's 3 plus or minus 3 square roots of 5 are our two solutions. Alright, so now what we need to do is check our work. So looking at our equation here where we have x, we're putting in 3 plus 3 square roots of 5. And then we had minus 3, so we still have the minus 3 here. Now what we're going to do is simplify inside the parentheses. So if you notice, this 3 and this negative 3 cancel each other. So we're just left with 3 square roots of 5, and we're going to square that. So 3 squared is 9, and square root of 5 squared is 5. Now next you would do your multiplication, which is 45 minus 5, which gives you 40, so that checks out. Now for this one, if you'd put in the minus 3 minus 3 square roots of 5, it would still work out the same, because this is still a positive 3 and this is still negative 3, so they zero out. And you're left with negative 3 square roots of 5 all squared. So negative 3 squared is 9, and square root of 5 squared is 5. So you have 45 minus 5, or 40, so that one checks out as well.